Hi, and welcome back to #Risk Digital. We've had some fantastic sessions today on cybersecurity, AI, and emerging technologies. And now we have a fantastic presentation from one of the UK's leading academics in the field of governance of emerging technologies. Professor Richard Self, Senior Lecturer in Governance of Advanced and Emerging Technologies at the University of Derby, is going to take us through his and his team's latest research in understanding the business potential for generative AI using the new SEAS framework. Richard, it's a pleasure to have you with us. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we've been looking at, over the last 20 years, the V's of big data to help us understand how we can possibly get value from big data. And then a year and a half ago, large language models, generative AI, burst into the sort of public awareness and into the business awareness. And we haven't really got a proper framework that helps us to really understand quite what's happening. How do we take account of all of the problems which we're seeing and yet get some see if we can get some value? And so I teach a module called Analytics, Ethics, Trust and Governance in our MSc for Big Data Analytics. And each year there's a sort of a general question, a very broad question, and the students have to find a small, narrow area. And this year's question was generative AI applications, questions of ethics, trust, and governance. And in the past, when I've been looking at non-generative AI, just ordinary sort of AI stuff, we could use things like GDPR. We could think about the European Union's AI Act and model cards and so on, but they're kind of difficult. You can't use it to really understand how do I get business value from these things. So we need to find a new framework and that it's useful for businesses, that's useful for students learning, useful for everybody to get a handle on what generative AI is actually doing. And these 5 students were particularly helpful in generating the C's that we come up with in the rest of this presentation. So thank you to all of those, to Peter, Chakudi, Chakutem, and Kashka and Sunday as well. So thank you to those guys. It's always nice to be able to give thanks to the right people, to the students, to get their names out there. Now, generative AI. Well, we've heard of ChatGPT, we've heard of Gemini, DALL-E 3. Some of us will have heard of OpenAI's text-to-video system called Sora. We've seen Claude. Loads of them. If you look on Hugging Face website, there's over thousands and thousands of different generative AI systems, sets of code, LLMs, diffusion models for images and so on. But the problem we're hearing more and more is about them dreaming, that they hallucinate, that they're away in the land of the fairies, that they're wrong. And we also hear and see that they are inordinately expensive in doing what they do. They're probably one of the most expensive technologies to train and provide anywhere in the world in any time over the last 60 years. Even more expensive and wasteful to run than, say, blockchains, it would turn out. So what is going on? We know that there's something called tokenization. We know that there are things called transformers or diffusion models. We know there's all sorts of stuff around these models to try to force them to actually be non-hallucinating, to force them to be telling the truth. But what happens is every time the developers add on a new thingy, whether it's, RLHF, whether it's RAG or knowledge graphs and etc., it all seems to have very, very little effect. So this raises the question, how do we work out whether all of this is hype or whether it's something that we can actually get to grips with and understand how it works and then understand sort of where we can possibly be able to use it? We know that if we are doing things in front of the transformer, the bit that really delivers the apparently high-grade text that's convincing, if we put it in front of that, it will still get mangled by the transformer. And this is actually a fundamental problem. And as we can see in these examples, I tried to get it to summarize my CV a few months ago. This was, I think this was ChatGPT. And it just gets the titles wrong. It gets, well, pretty much everything wrong. A more interesting and slightly more subtle problem is this one, where this was Microsoft Copilot, as you can tell from the URLs that are provided at the bottom here. It actually picks up one from a wrong organization. It's not Derby University. This is somebody down in southern Wales. And he doesn't know how to connect me with him and work out that we're different. Or this one, sorry, I'd go back one, because here, this one's interesting as well. What the transformer has done, what ChatGPT has done, has taken the real title of the presentation and then changed it to something that means about the same, but isn't the same. And that's a problem when you're writing a CV or an abstract. You've got to get the facts actually correct. There are some things that cannot be changed. The rest, some of it, yeah, in an abstract can be done. If any of you have looked at the Sora videos that OpenAI have produced, and they're the showcase of the best things they've been able to create. So anything up to about a minute's worth of video. It has all sorts of each of the videos, although very, very clever technically, has all sorts of odd things. And around about this timestamp on this is a real key video. Her legs pass through each other. There are problems with Gemini. Google's Gemini did some ahistoric pictures of Vikings, except we know that Vikings were never black. Very woke. And as a result of this, Google removed the image capability of Gemini for a while. We also have problems around the trustworthiness. A lot of people are saying you can use or should be using language models in education as a sort of mental guide, micro teaching, understanding the students. What one of my students did was to just look at 3 variations of wording as different children might ask the question around something like, how do plants use sunlight to make food? And this is rather interesting because this is investigating the capability of the transformer to understand the concepts behind the question and stick to those. But it turns out that in actual fact, it's not very good at doing that. And the way that you pose the questions, and you can just change one word in the sequence for a synonym, and you begin to see variability in the output. And I got 1 or 2 students who are doing some similar type of work for their master's dissertations this term. And we'll be looking at how using the way that different people ask different questions to evaluate the accuracy and the completeness and the consistency of the answers. And so we were looking at the similarity in terms of synonyms of these questions, and then to see what comes out of these things. It gives us a very interesting way of testing these sorts of questions around accuracy, consistency, completeness. Because in some applications, accuracy is vital. Education is vital. Law is vital. We've seen how solicitors, lawyers around the world have been getting themselves into trouble because they allowed or they asked ChatGPT or one of the LLMs to create a brief, including relevant case titles. And the first one, which hit the news, of course, was the one in New York. And eventually, after having come up with a brief which hadn't been checked, with 6 mythical hallucinated cases, the judge got so irritated that he fined the lawyer about $5,000. It's a problem. It really, really is a big problem. And so as we think about governance, about risk, as we think about compliance, we start having to think awfully carefully about our use cases, the examples where we're going to be using these tools, and think about, what is our risk? What areas of compliance do we have to meet? Professional compliance issues, the regulations that govern our industries or our business sectors. And then we start having to think rather carefully. The question around whether the thing is a tool for specialists, in other words, you know most of the answer before you actually pose the question, so that you can fact check every single aspect of the answer. Or is it something that's reliable enough that you can put it out into the public sector and everybody in the world can use it as a rather expensive to run alternative to a search engine? And you then start thinking about the hype cycles. People like Sam Altman, the creator of OpenAI, who thinks this is a step on the path to this thing called artificial general intelligence, as if we need that. But perhaps it could do, perhaps it can't. There are actually indications that language models and the transformer technique is rapidly approaching the limitations of its capability. You might say that not a glass ceiling that can be broken, but a really solid ceiling that cannot be broken. Doesn't matter how much more text they feed into it, how much more training materials, how much more compute cycles they put into training. It looks as though the capabilities are plateauing. So beware of some of the longer term hype. And what we're really trying to look at from your perspective in terms of governance, risk, compliance, and also for the IT managers, the chief information officers, is how do I work out whether generative AI is suitable for my situation, has any role to play in my situation? Or what are the fundamental, most critical questions that I need to be asking? Do I need to create a special governance strategy that is actually dedicated to generative AI? And then, like I mentioned before, you also need to be thinking of some of these questions around where do the regulations and laws come to play? So this led to this idea of a set of words that start with a common letter. C, it turned out in the end, was rather a useful one. And we started working through in our seminar classes about what sort of words beginning with C are kind of interesting. And the first two were the top of you might say, of the two pyramids. The challenges in using generative AI. Are we actually pushing this sort of huge boulder up the hill? Is it going to come back suddenly, squash us as it rolls back down? And then there's the consequences. Where do the consequences sort of spread out and multiply and affect more and more and more things around our business, about our business activities? Or are some of the consequences going to be such that they come whizzing round the back and hit us from behind before we even realize that we got a problem? And the idea of having these C words is that we can begin to fathom and evaluate in our context, our use case, our requirements, specification for our usage of the system. What are the challenges? What are the consequences? So we started by thinking about in these sort of terms. Do we understand the technology? How does it work? Do we understand what a transformer does? Do we understand what these diffusion models are doing? Do we understand what it can do? Do we understand that it's really a whole, basically probabilistic exercise, and which led to it being these things being called stochastic parrots by people like Emily Bender, Margaret Mitchell, back about 3-4 years ago? Or can it do something? Can it understand the words we're using? Can it reason? Can it plan? And people are actually trying to get it to plan out activities, do project management planning, in other words. And yet we're seeing so many examples, and some of you who may be on LinkedIn who are connected to me or connected to others of my circle will see an incredible range of artificial, what you might call idiocies, not intelligence, but idiocies, because it doesn't actually have an understanding. The mechanisms by which it is created and trained destroy meaning. They don't contain any sources. They can't link to the training material sources that they were trained on. There is no element of logic or symbolic logic built into LLMs at the moment. So we have a lot of interesting questions. Do you understand the technology adequately to be able to make a judgment? And then we need to be thinking about the sort of consequences at the high level initially. What will happen, what might happen, because there's these impacts that happen either to ourselves or to our clients, our customers, our suppliers. What are the harms that might happen? In medicine, if you get the diagnosis wrong, you've got a dead person potentially. That's kind of the highest level harm that can happen, possibly. And then we've all read massively about intellectual property infringement, both in terms of fair use of training materials or not fair use, and so on and so forth. So the challenges now, we can look at things like capability. We need to be thinking in particular about creativity and clarity as well, because people are saying, well, the nice thing about having this dreamlike hallucinatory capability is that it is creative. It comes up with new stuff. Think about that very, very carefully. In clarity, do we understand what it's saying? Do we really know how it's producing what it comes up with? So if we then go below the capability, we end up with 7 second level, third level C words. And we start looking at things like components and connections. The elements, the RLHF, the RAG, the transformers, the knowledge bases, the knowledge graphs, etc., and how these are connected. How do those work in delivering the sort of result that we need, whether it's accuracy, whether it's consistency, and so on and so forth? I'm going to jump across to the second set of 3, the correctness, consistency, and completeness, because these are areas that are very, very easy to test. And they're also very easy to think about in terms of your specific business requirements, the sort of things that are going to deliver your business value. You see, there are people who are saying in, say, the field of generating computer code, I can do it very, very quickly. There are people who are saying, if I get it to do some searching because it's using Bing or whatever, I can get a first draft ever so quickly. I can save 10-20% of my time. But and if I try it for the fields I'm working in, I'm sure for many of the fields that you're working in, I have problems with correctness, consistency, and completeness. The completeness one means that it only gives about between a third and 2/3 of the relevant information in any given response. So that means I need to run the machine with the same question or prompt 3, 4, 5 times. But because I know that part of that is incorrect or just hallucinated or wrong, it's an error, I then have to think about the correctness. I need to know or be able to research, is all of this stuff accurate? Is it correct? Is it supported by whatever evidence? And that leads me to think, ultimately, when I'm working with this, adds 20, 30, 40% to my workload to sort out the consistency, completeness, and correctness problems, and then synthesize back to a result, which would be much easier to get to if I'd just done the searches myself and then created my own synthesis. Because one thing we do know as human beings, once we've got a draft, we generally find it incredibly difficult to put that sort of effort in, to modify it, to check it, to do all the things that are necessary to get a piece of polished work. Control becomes very, very important when you're thinking of creativity. People are saying, oh, I can create my advertising materials and so on and so forth so easily. But then you step back, and I got several students looking at this question because they got experience in this sort of generating marketing materials and so on. And you think very carefully about how you brief your team, how you work with your team, how you are setting out the details of your demographics, of your target audience, and all of these other sorts of questions which become very, very important. And so you then start thinking about, how do I control, can I control how the output will be? And we can see with our image generating stuff that it's very, very difficult to control the imagery that comes from DALL-E 3. Saw that what example of the Black Vikings, ahistorical, it didn't happen. And when we look at connotation, this gets very, very important in the world of marketing and advertising. Connotation is a word that relates to meaning, not the overt high-level meaning, the main meaning we use of a word, but it refers to those subtleties that are tacit knowledge, that separate different groups. We read a word and it means a bit different to each group. And when you're looking at advertising, when you're looking at marketing, those sort of tacit messages are really, really important. And it doesn't understand those things. And I've got, again, another couple of students looking at this question of connotation, looking at the question of control. And it's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of that over the next 6-8 weeks as they finish off their projects. Then when we start thinking about the components, we talked about the transformers and all the other bits. These are a whole range of issues that are part of the way that generative AI and language models and diffusion models actually work. Do we actually understand the consequences of some of these different aspects? People think of language models, or are saying that language models are capable of storing lots of knowledge, so you can use it instead of a search engine. But a large language model is a model of language and the way that words follow words. It's not explicitly ever designed to be a model of knowledge on the internet. Hence the question about storage infrastructure, about computational infrastructure, which is astronomical. To run OpenAI's GPT, they're using the largest supercomputer complex in the world. And they can't make money out of their £20 a month, $20, £20 a month fees for the paid users. Doesn't begin to pay for the costs. And so to run it in-house, which is what people are doing, you still need some serious infrastructure. And you've got things like connections, and testing becomes really, really important. Have you tested real life situations several or many, many times? Have you proved that it's safe to use? Have you proved that it is accurate as much of the time as you need it to? I'm not going to force you to have 100% accuracy. That might be difficult. Even humans aren't necessarily accurate 100% of the time. But what is the level that you need? How much content has to be correct? and how much of the totality of a correct answer needs to be available in the first question prompt. These are sort of questions that come out of connections. And these are some really intriguing questions around the question of control. Some of them are very, very technical, such as hyperparameter settings. However, some of these other ones are very much related to what you're trying to achieve. We've all heard, seen, and laughed at the question where someone put a prompt in DALL-E 3 and said, please produce me a picture of a room without an elephant. And every single image that's created from that prompt, time after time after time, always has an elephant in the picture somehow. Maybe a picture of an elephant on the wall, or maybe a real live elephant in the room. These are sort of questions you need to be thinking of. There's also one that goes outside, which looks at who controls these monopolies. Do we trust OpenAI? Do we trust Google? Do we trust Microsoft? Do we trust Anthropic? And so on. And what happens if one or other of these goes under? Where's the control going? Now, the question of correctness is quite important. Is it about the exact words, or is it about the concepts? How correct does it have to be? Do you require correctness? Again, a question that's really very important. The consistency one becomes even more interesting as we look across the world. In the West here, we think of consistency very much around the concept of ideas, around the concepts. But there are parts of the world, and some of my students come from those parts of the world, where the consistency, particularly things like education, are going to be judged at word levels. They must have the same sequence of words every time the question is asked. Which do you need, or do you not need it at all? Connotation, here's a whole series of aspects that maybe in law, certainly in creative writing, creative art, certainly in these various fields where we've got to think about the meaning, yes. So we know that there's nothing built into a large language model that actually understands meaning or concepts, although there's a little bit of indication coming out of Anthropic about concepts being kind of generated or collated. And what about the symbols, semiology, history, culture, and tacit knowledge? How does that all come together? So lots and lots, and then in consequences, costs, running cost. The competition leads you to be thinking about what happens if somebody buys somebody up, or if somebody goes under. What are my plans? Part of your business continuity planning will start be thinking about those sort of questions. Compliance, well, that's part of the title of the organization running this conference. How do we demonstrate compliance? So financial services and legal services are going to be hit particularly. Then context covers a huge range that we need to be thinking about. So here is a summary of the 16 C's of generative AI. I already have one organization in the USA, I think it is actually testing out how this works with some of their clients. So if any of you would like to contact me, r.j.self@derby.ac.uk is the email address, and I can easily send you a copy of this presentation if you would like to try it out for yourselves. Is it a tool? for everybody or specialist tool? Think about that one as well. Those are the fundamental questions that we now need to think about. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
On mute, can't even use technology. Thank you, Richard, for a fantastic and fascinating session there on the 16 C's of looking at Gen AI, starting with some of the artificial idiocies around mangling your CV, Sora video errors, how photosynthesis works. I think even my GCSE science, I could probably cope with that. Interesting how LLMs may be approaching the ceiling of their capabilities and may not be moving towards Gen AI as the hype would seem to suggest. Thinking about specialist and general use of AI systems and LLMs, and his 16 C's: challenges, capability, components, connections, control, correctness, consistency, completeness, and connotation, creativity, clarity, and consequences, with cost, competition, compliance, and context. Fantastic. And as Richard said, you can contact him at Derby University for that presentation. That was incredibly thought-provoking. Thank you so much, Richard. A real pleasure. Okay, stay with us because we have even more insightful panel sessions to come. Next up is promoting a secure by design culture in AI. See you in a minute.